Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is wonderful to be with you on this Thursday morning where I am. If you're in a different part of the world, it's a different time for you. Um, Gonna have a really important conversation today. Last week, we had a conversation with Amar Ali Jan on, kind of some of the history of Pakistan and India in particular, as it seemed like there was a likelihood of military, conflict starting to, you know, kick off basically or take place, heightened tensions around that in the region. That has since happened. Events are developing rather quickly, but there has been, bombing, there has been drone strikes. And in the midst of this, both as kind of a flashpoint, is obviously Kashmir, which is a region disputed between the polities of India and Pakistan. It is a region with its own people, its own self determination struggles, and our guest here today, Mohamad Junaid, is going to join us to talk a little bit about that history, and to share a little bit more of a kind of Kashmiri perspective, history from that lens, and also thinking about Kashmir as a prism to kind of understand the region and some of the conflicts and some of the politics of the Indian subcontinent. So I'm gonna welcome our guest to the stage now, actually. And the first question that I have for you really is just to take a second and kind of introduce yourself to our audience, and talk a little bit about, your own your work and kind of who you are, how you come to this subject.
Thank you, Jared, for having me today. My name is Mohamad Junaid. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. I study military occupations, memory, history. My specialization is on Kashmir. Um, my interest in Kashmir arises from the fact that I am a Kashmiri. I'm a Kashmiri scholar. I was born and grew up in Kashmir in the 1980s and 1990s, 2000s. I came to the US in 2009 to do my doctorate in anthropology. And since 2018, I've been teaching here in the Berkshires, Massachusetts.
Awesome, thank you. So let's start with kind of recent events. We're gonna do a lot of kind of hopefully going through some of the history and some of the political economy, and talking about the role of colonialism, imperialism, and as well as decolonization as well, I'm sure. But let's just start with the more recent events. Talk about what you think is important to know and understand about recent events in the region.
So the recent events started on April 22nd when in a tourist spot in South Kashmir, where I actually grew up, um, Hindu men were lined up and shot. Um, the ev- the people who were there present, like relatives of these men, claimed that the people who shot them asked them about their identity. They did not shoot women and children. They focused specifically on men. Uh, Later on, some reports indicated that several of those people may have been high-ranking officials within the Indian security establishment. There definitely was a naval officer. There were probably some people associated with the intelligence bureau. It's hard to determine. Like, there's a lot of fog around the identities, who they were, but it's clear that a majority of them were ordinary tourists from India. There was a Kashmiri Muslim man who was shot as well. Apparently, he was trying to sort of hustle with those who were shooting and got shot in the process. Immediately after this event, Kashmiris sort of gathered across South Asia. They provided care, food, shelter to the tourists who were scared. They opened their homes. There were hotels that canceled the fees and allowed tourists to stay. there was a genuine outpouring of grief across Kashmir. Um, because not only because Kashmiris have sort of economic interest in tourism, in fact, tourism accounts for probably around 7% of the economy in Kashmir. But because Kashmiris have gone through a lot themselves, and in the last 30 years of India's colonial war in Kashmir, close to 100,000 Kashmiris have died, and so this was a tragic event that sort of caused a significant loss of life. Now, while this was going on in India, the media ecosystem, which has become quite extremist and radicalized over the years, started demonizing Kashmiris, demonizing Muslims in general, and calling for revenge. And it immediately led to attacks against Kashmiri students all across India. They were harassed, in several cases attacked, told to sort of chant Indian national anthem and Indian national slogans. And many of them had to return to Kashmir. In Kashmir itself, close to 3,000 people were arrested arbitrarily. The Indian government claimed that they were what it calls overground workers. These are people who have been marked for years and whose names are in police files as protesters, as people whose relatives might have been associated with militancy at some point. And so they were like, there was a collective punishment going on. 70 of them apparently have been like targeted for what is called the Public Safety Act, which is a colonial era law that is, basically it allows the state to arrest you without any charges, and they can keep you in prison for 6 months to 2 years without any trial. Um, Also, what happened was the Indian government started bombing the houses of people who they claimed were associated with the militants who had carried out the attack. Um, I think around 7 to 8 houses were bombed, but in many places, entire neighborhoods sort of suffered because of these. These were the Indian government, sort of the media took pictures of these. They displayed them on Indian TV networks. These were sort of spectacles of showing that, see, we can dominate them. We are taking revenge. So on one side, the Indian government claims that Kashmiris are its citizens. On the other hand, it was treating them as an enemy upon whom revenge had to be taken. Then there was a simultaneous conversation going on within the Indian sort of media circus and the government circles that they wanted to sort of take revenge against Pakistan. Within minutes of the attack, Indian government blamed Pakistan. And the Pakistani government sort of basically said we had nothing to do with it and wanted some kind of investigation. The Indian government was having none of it. It did not share any evidence. And then on the night of May 6th and 7th, Indian government launched missiles into two regions, mainland Pakistan and in Pakistani administered side of Kashmir, or Pakistani controlled side of Kashmir. In those events, 31 people apparently have been killed. These are civilians, clearly. There are children, women. Many of them have died in southern Punjab, which is one of the poor regions of Punjab, mostly Saraiki people. And then in what is called Azad Jammu and Kashmir, or Pakistani controlled side of Kashmir, where most of the places hit were mosques and people's properties. And I mean, these are essentially Kashmiris who have historically been displaced and been targeted by Indian artillery over the years. So the picture that emerged was that India was determined to take revenge against civilian targets. In fact, the Indian government said that they have not targeted any military targets. But it called these places, these were mosques and stuff. They called them terrorist infrastructure, which is also hard to determine what that means. In response, during the same events as India was launching missiles, Pakistani governments claimed that it had shot down 5 Indian fighter planes. We don't know yet the exact details of that, but the pictures, the images that I've seen coming from Kashmir, there was some confirmation from the way Kashmiris were speaking about them in Kashmiri that India probably did lose some planes. It's, I think, clear that probably 4 planes have gone down. And so there's a previous incident that happened in 2019 when a militant attack against a paramilitary bus in Kashmir caused significant casualties of Indian forces. And in response, the Modi government launched cross-border attacks at that time too. While and during that process, India lost a plane, and one of its pilots actually landed in Pakistan, who was arrested and then was sent back. The Pakistani government sort of used that event as a way to like claim that we have sort of responded. This time around too, the Pakistani government seems to be in two minds that whether they have responded by shooting down the planes or, but there is also pressure in Pakistan, I believe, that Pakistani military is actually under great pressure to sort of respond to these attacks on civilian sites. Because the Pakistani military has been not very popular over the last few years, especially after the arrest of Imran Khan. And so I think that if they back down, it seems that they might be perceived as even more less popular. In the same way, in India, there's a lot of pressure. The right-wing media ecosystem, which has essentially wiped out, any sane voices. There used to be some sane voices, a lot of sane voices in India, which used to sort of like come and contextualize these events. And those anyone who is even suggesting that we should just back down from the war rhetoric is being sort of claimed to be an anti-national, and people are telling them to go to Pakistan then. So what has happened is that my sense is that a lot of this is a media-generated war. And in India, which is like, I mean, currently they are the ones who instigated this cross-border attack with missiles. Um, like their actions were really determined by the right-wing media ecosystem because I mean, the BJP, the ruling party in India right now, they have nurtured these forces, and I mean, Modi's entire image since 2002, when he sort of presided over a massacre in his home state of Gujarat, has been built on the fact that he's a muscular sort of leader, nationalist leader, who's going to teach Kashmiris a lesson, teach Indian Muslims a lesson, teach Bangladeshis a lesson, teach Pakistanis a lesson. And so for him to back down and sort of assess reasonably what South Asia needs is very hard right now. And we hear that last night there is another escalation, right? India has launched some kind of a drone attack on some military sites near heavily populated centers like Lahore and elsewhere, Bahawalpur, and I think that that just means that it's just like literally pressuring Pakistan to respond. One of the things I heard yesterday was that the national security advisors of the two countries, Pakistani NSA was recently appointed precisely for this purpose, had been in communication. They wanted clearly some kind of de-escalation and off-ramp from this, but I mean, the overnight events have shown that that has not turned out to be true.
Thank you for, kind of laying out all of this. One of the pieces, and I know that all of this is like challenging to talk about, but there was I've seen a lot of conflicting reports about whether the initial attack has been sort of claimed. Like there was sort of a report that was claimed by some group called the Resistance Front, basically, and then there was as you said, India said, well, Pakistan, funds this force and has sponsored this attack, basically, so blaming Pakistan for it. And then I also read other places that the resistance front, later said, no, we don't claim responsibility for this. And then when we talked to Amar Ali John, he was sort of like, nobody really knows what this organization is or who this organization is. And so I don't know. But it's interesting because on some level, I also see on social media, even people on the left in the West saying, look, this attack was claimed by you know, a, a militant group that is engaged in Kashmiri self-determination, right? And so there's a lot of, I think, noise around this, but not a lot of clarity. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Um, I do actually. We have to understand the context of the place, that is Kashmir. It is heavily militarized, probably one of the most militarized region in the world. There are probably close to 750,000 Indian soldiers concentrated in a territory which is quite small. And these include both regular armed forces and then counterinsurgency formations like Rashtriya Rifles, BSF, which is the Border Security Force, CRPF, which is the paramilitary force, and then the Kashmir Police, which has, I think, around close to 80,000 personnel. And Jammu Kashmir Police is also heavily involved in what India calls the counterinsurgency, counterterrorism operations. This is, people have previously suggested that there is like one soldier for every 10 Kashmiris. Every single inch of Kashmir is heavily surveilled. And the place where these attacks took place, it's called Baisaran. It's a adjoining valley to Pahalgam. Pahalgam is a tourist hotspot, and Baisaran is an adjoining valley. It's a meadow where, strangely enough, there were like hundreds of tourists, but no security, which is very surprising. And it's also surprising that these people who attacked knew exactly that there was no security there, that they seem to have ample time to sort of pick out their targets. Um, the Indian government claimed that there was two Pakistani militants and two Kashmiri origin militants who had attacked, which is interesting because, and it claimed it within a matter of few minutes. In fact, and so it surprises me that that the Indian government may have known who these people were, and it's impossible, literally, to escape the dragnet of surveillance and security that exists in Kashmir. You know, as compared to these 750,000 Indian forces in Kashmir, there are less than 100 militants. There have, over the last 20 years, there have never been more than 200 to 300 militants operating in Kashmir. And since 2019, their numbers have drastically reduced. An average lifespan of a militant in Kashmir is almost like 6 months. They don't live very long because of this dragnet. Now, what might have possibly happened? This organization TRF, the Resistance Front, has some social media sort of sites. They post these videos and stuff occasionally, but over the years, it seems to me that they were mostly involved in sort of doing the social media thing rather than any actual actions on the ground. Most of these actions were focused actually on the southern part of the Pir Panjal Mountains, which is the areas, hilly areas, mountainous areas south of South Kashmir, where Indian forces have been sort of like been attacked and they've been battling the sort of the militants. Um, Now, if you want to look at the proper context of what might have happened, we have to understand the 1990s in Kashmir. In 1990, there was an armed uprising in Kashmir against the Indian government. These were Kashmiris who wanted independence. Some of those groups wanted to merge with Pakistan, but that uprising was literally crushed within the next 4 or 5 years. And by 1995, there was an entire counterinsurgency operation in place. Soldiers had fanned out everywhere. There was no public space available. This is kind of my work that I do. There was no public space available anywhere for Kashmiris. And during that time, the Indian government deliberately created a counterinsurgent force, composed of some turned militants and some other. They recruited specifically from the what are called the Gujar and Pahari communities in Jammu. Some of them were recruited in the Kashmir police as part of the special operations group. Others became part of what came to be called Ikhwan. Ikhwan is like it's a counterinsurgency militia that basically the Indian state then turned against Kashmiris. They wreaked havoc across Kashmir. And one of the pointers to what happened is that in 1995, a group of 6 Western tourists were abducted in the same region of Pahalgam. And one of them escaped, and later on, 5 of them were found. They were actually never found out, but it was presumed that they were dead. But 2 British journalists later, Adrian Levy and Kathy Scott Clark, wrote a book called The Meadow, in which they claimed that these Western tourists had died actually at the hands of counterinsurgents, these Ikhwani militias. Then in 2000, March 2000, President Bill Clinton was visiting South Asia. He was in India, and there was an attack in Chatti Singhpura, which is a small village, a hilly village in South Kashmir. 35 Sikh men were targeted and killed. And the Indian government claimed that the Pakistani militants had sort of done this. And then in a matter of few days, they claimed that the 5 militants involved had been killed and shot and killed. But there were protests all across Kashmir because the relatives of these men claimed that these were civilians who had been picked up and murdered. Their faces were defaced. Their bodies were burnt, and they were buried in a mountainous region called Pansaltan. And after the protests were brutally put down, 8 people were shot down by this special operations group in Anantnag in a place called Brakpura. But it kind of created waves, international news. Clinton later claimed that that it was India or Hindu militants who had done it. There was conflicting evidence about what had happened. Some Sikhs claimed that it was militant, some claimed that it was actually Indian forces, because the people who were had killed had been in Indian military uniforms. In any case, when there was these 5 people who had been buried, their DNA was taken. They were exhumed, their DNAs were taken. In the government, first of all, fudged the DNA samples, but eventually it was realized that these were actually civilians. One of them was a cloth merchant. None of them, and 2 of them were, Gujar men, from a marginalized sort of ethnic group among Kashmiri Muslims. And so none of them had anything to do with the killing of the Sikh men. But it kind of like sort of allowed people to imagine that what India had created during this counterinsurgency war was a murky situation where all these different kinds of actors, many of them conflict entrepreneurs, many of them part of security agencies or locals who were on the payroll of the Indian security masters, could be tactically used to create attacks, false flag operations, and in any case, there was not any previous instance of anti-Sikh violence in Kashmir. In fact, Sikhs and Muslims share a historical bond with each other, just like Kashmiri Hindus and Kashmiri Muslims share a historical bond with each other. They all consider themselves as part of Kashmir. Um, and so this time also, it came like all the Kashmiri parties, those who are allied with India, the National Conference and the PDP and other parties, as well as those who are sort of part of the historical movement for self-determination, they have all decried these events. Like the chief preacher of the Jama Masjid in Srinagar, the Mirwais, held a morning session in the big mosque there for them. But I mean, I think that the events that have followed are either a deliberate sort of set of steps meant to create chaos in South Asia, or that because of this media ecosystem, the governments will now be forced to take tit for tat actions, revenge actions that will go up the escalatory ladder. And your audience has to know that this is a huge region. While we know that India is the most populated country on earth now, it has 1.45 billion people. Pakistan is no small country. It has 255 million people, and like US is close around 345. So it's a huge country. It's I think area wise may not look so big, but it's a densely populated region. Both countries have 170 nuclear weapons each. This is the first conflict, direct conflict, that is erupting between countries that have declared nuclear weapons. And they both sort of have doctrines where, I mean, India has a conventional sort of superiority over Pakistan in numbers. But Pakistan has significant conventional capabilities as well. They both sort of can field millions and millions of soldiers. It's these are not small countries, and any missteps, and Pakistan has like said officially that if its existence as a state came under threat, and I don't know what its red lines are, but it's clear that if there was like an incursion that felt like that government was kind of going to create a situation where a significant territory of Pakistan was going to be held by India, Pakistan will start using their tactical nuclear weapons, their nuclear weapons. India, in fact, had a doctrine called the Cold Start Doctrine that it developed in the 80s and 90s, and which basically meant that the Indian government would, in a situation of emerging conflict, it would initiate a massive incursion into a significant part of Pakistan and hold that territory and use that territory as a negotiating point. And for Pakistan, that is precisely the red line. And we are very close, very, very close. People don't realize it, to some kind of a nuclear Armageddon. There was a study done in, I think, 2011 and it was published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. These are US based nuclear physicists who wrote a piece about what would happen if India and Pakistan started a nuclear exchange. It would immediately, within hours, lead to deaths of close to 140 million people on both sides. Major population centers across South Asia would be decimated and become unlivable for generations. But not only that, it would create a dust cloud huge enough which would lead to crop failures across the world. It would drastically and dramatically change the climate patterns across the globe. So this is, you have seen probably on social media, there are people who are joking around this. There's a meme war going on, but there's Indian media ecosystem You have to see their studios. There are like they have these animations of jets and bombs that fly out of the studios. But all of this is an extremely dangerous situation, especially in the present world order, where we know that the international norms and laws are extremely fragile. Over the last 5, 6 years, we are living in a world where there are no sort of forces that can like bring warring parties to a negotiating table. Our government here is sort of claiming that they're watching, but they're also, it's almost like washing their hands off of it. Like, there's already too much happening in the world, so we don't have to deal with it. But I mean, we'll soon perhaps, and hopefully not, realize that we wish we had dealt with it earlier.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for all of that. I wanted to pivot a little bit. We'll come back, I think, as we talk a little bit more about some of the current events and especially some of the geopolitics. People are already asking questions about China in the chat, and I know that's something that we will want to come back to. Um, but what I wanted to talk with you about is something you said to me the other day, which is that something along the lines of the idea, I'm just sort of paraphrasing here, that Kashmir is a prism through which we can understand a great deal about the politics of the Indian subcontinent. So, could you just share a little bit more about what you mean by this idea?
Yeah, Kashmir is both a prism and a prison. It's I'll explain why it is a prism, but it's also a prison to these extremist ideologies, nationalist ideologies that have emerged in post-colonial South Asia. Let me give you a slightly, um, it will be long, but a little more contextualized answer to what I mean by it is a prism and a prison. So in 1947, we know that the British sort of withdrew from their empire in South Asia. There were two sets of elite and that had emerged in South Asia at that time. There was the upper caste Hindu elite who sort of dominated the Congress Party. On the other hand, were the Muslim feudal elite who dominated what was the Muslim League. There was a third formation, which was the subterranean force of the Hindu nationalism that had emerged in the late 19th century, early 20th century in the form of Hindu Mahasabha, and then the emergence of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, in 1925. These were the three main forces that had emerged in South Asia during the era of colonialism. British, we know that their policy of divide and rule in South Asia had led to the creation of this elite. On the Pakistan, on the Muslim side, it was clear that there was the landed elite who by early 1930s had been demanding proportional representation in the future government. There were elections to be held in 1935, and they wanted proportional representation. They wanted Muslims to have a separate electorate. There were other groups in South Asia who demanded a separate electorate or proportional representation. These primarily included the depressed caste groups, who are primarily now called Dalits. It's a huge percentage of the population, close to 20 to 25% of the population. So in 1930s, the British came up with something called a communal award, which allowed proportional representation. While the Congress said yes to proportional representation or representation for Muslims and other religious groups, they denied the depressed caste groups a proportional representation. In fact, Gandhi went on a fast, and there was something called a Pune Pact, which he signed with the leader of the depressed caste, Ambedkar. And so what happened was by 1947, the Muslim elite, landed elite, demanded a separate state of Pakistan because what they saw rising within the Congress itself and within the Hindu right wing was a growing Hindu nationalism, which Hindu nationalism of the RSS was sort of built on the idea of two sort of ideas. One was that Hindus are historical victims of Muslim rule in South Asia, and second was that of their own supremacy, that India should be a Hindu majority nation, that it claimed that Hindus were the original people in South Asia, while the Muslims were foreign. Their what they call the Punya Bhumi was in Mecca, which is their holy place, were in Mecca, so they didn't belong. Um, and which created a lot of anxiety among Muslims, because these are, like, all of them are mostly indigenous peoples, indigenous in the sense that they have been historically living in these regions. Some converted to different religions along the way. Doesn't mean that they were not part of that historical sort of region. And in 1947, the Congress Party sort of agreed to the partition of the subcontinent. um, the subcontinent itself was basically a mosaic of sort of layered and shared sovereignties. There were directly ruled regions of the British India, and there were the what are called the princely states. There were close to 540 of them princely states. Kashmir was also a princely state. In fact, among all the princely states, it had the highest degree of sovereignty. It was ruled by Hindu sort of feudal dynasty called the Dogras. The majority of the people, close to 80%, were Muslims, but the ruling dynasty was a Hindu dynasty. They were from the southern Jammu region. They had ruled Kashmir by force. They were a feudal dynasty, so they were very expropriatory. Kashmiris had been sort of reduced to basically landless peasants. Most Kashmiris were artisans or peasantry and lived in almost like conditions that resemble enslavement. So we'll come back to that point in a little bit. After 1947, India and Pakistan emerged. Both were insufficiently imagined ideas. In India, the Congress Party, knowing that South Asia was this mosaic of identities, nationalities, languages, histories, wanted to create a very centralized unitary state. The Congress Party itself sort of created a party state because it was more like a platform rather than a party, which sort of had within it it was primarily upper caste formation, but it had Hindu nationalists, it had some token Muslims, it had a few Dalit leaders, but who did not have much voice, for themselves. And on the Pakistani side, it was again an insufficiently imagined idea because most of the leaders of the Pakistan movement actually came from the north, sort of eastern part of India, the British India, called Uttar Pradesh, and they became the new leaders of this region on the western flanks of South Asia, including Punjab, Sindh. So they kind of thought that Muslim identity would be enough, sufficient to kind of create a cohesive nation. I mean, one of the ironies of the situation was that the other side of Pakistan was actually thousands of miles away in what eventually became Bangladesh, which was also the sign when in Bangladesh emerged in 1971 that Muslim identity perhaps was not enough. One couldn't simply rely on a Muslim identity if there are underlying sort of problems of unequal distribution of resources and power. In India, the same thing happened. The Indian government, the Congress Party created a paternalistic sort of system where it claimed to speak for all of Indians. And under this sign of secularism, they erased the actual realities of inequality, both of communalism in South Asia, like anti-Muslim, rhetoric and politics that was happening on the ground, but also more problematically, the inequalities of caste. Dalits remained unequal. They were given some, status of scheduled caste and stuff, a little bit of affirmative action, but nothing major. And so eventually, India in the 1980s sort of started to slowly give up on the secular idea. Congress Party itself allowed the secularism to fall because there was a caste assertion. New types of caste groups who became called dominant castes started emerging and asserting their political authority in regions like Maharashtra, in Andhra Pradesh, in Bihar, and Uttar Pradesh, and it led to emergent destruction of the Congress Party eventually. And in reaction to both the caste politics and to secularism, Hindu nationalism, which had been like always present in the blood vein of the Indian politics, alongside this hardened version of Hindu nationalism, had emerged, and it grew in power. And eventually, in 2002, when Modi sort of presided over this massacre of Muslims in his home state, it was the first sign that Indian politics had sort of completely changed. It had given up on even this token idea of secularism. That Modi's politics was about creating sort of space for the other castes. It created some sort of caste alliance. In fact, in Gujarat during 2002, some of the lower caste communities also participated in the killing of Muslims. But that once Modi came to power in 2014, he had claimed that he will bring development and all of that. Those promises started to fray in 2000 by 2019. And it was during this time that he, first of all, sort of, abrogated Article 370, which we can come back to in a little bit, in Kashmir, which was sort of an article in the Indian Constitution that gave Kashmir a semi-autonomous status, and also launched these attacks against cross-border attacks against Pakistan. And so he got re-elected. And since then, what his regime has done is pass a series of laws that are primarily meant to disenfranchise and disempower Indian Muslims. And Indian Muslims constitute close to 15 to 16% of the population. And in absolute numbers, there are like 200 million of them. And so Hindutva politics that emerged after Modi's rise to power was centered on like creating these tactical strategic alliances with other caste communities, which were claimed that they were also part of Hinduism. On the other hand, it meant externalizing Muslims, like harassing them, and creating spectacles of that domination. And on the Pakistani side, this after the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, it doubled down on this idea that Islam might be the unifying factor. In fact, there was a failed experiment with Islamization in Pakistan in 1980s when General Ziaul Haq became the dictator of that country. He also was given to a lot of spectacles and that he was a pious general and stuff, but in reality what he was doing was participating in the US and Saudi-led war in Afghanistan, and it's what American politicians at that time thought was the great Islamic sort of struggle against the evil empire. And becoming a conduit for weapons, and all of this, and when Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, Pakistan was forgotten in the West. In 1998, India conducted its nuclear tests, and Pakistan followed after 3 weeks later in May 1998. It led to sanctions on both countries, but by this time, the US government wanted to be closer to India. But then the 9/11 attacks happened, and Pakistan became what US calls a frontline state. The new dictator General Musharraf, sort of allowed the use of Pakistani airspace and air bases to the US military and Air Force to conduct. In fact, they allowed US to conduct drone attacks on their own civilian population. India also wanted to do the same thing, but since Pakistan was closer, to Afghanistan, so the US thought it might be easier. So this is like this broader context in which South Asian politics has emerged, and why I say that Kashmir is a prism to understand this is because as a region that both countries lay a claim on, in 1947, as I said, Kashmir was indeed, it was a Muslim majority. It is a Muslim majority region. It has 80%, the historical state of Kashmir, which includes Valley of Kashmir. It includes the area of Kashmir, that Azad Jammu and Kashmir, which is under Pakistani administration, Gilgit-Baltistan, Ladakh, Jammu. In 1947, this region had close to 77 to 80% Muslim population. Pakistan claimed that since it was a Muslim majority region and partition had happened on communal lines, that Muslim majority regions that had contiguous border with Pakistan would join Pakistan. And India claimed, India did not have, of course, a solid claim on it. In fact, Nehru had been a vocal opponent of the princely rulers. At least in rhetoric, he had denounced the Maharaja, Hindu Maharaja of Kashmir. Historical sort of evidence suggests that the Maharaja of Kashmir at that time wanted to remain independent. In fact, there were some Kashmiri sort of organizations that wanted to maintain some kind of like a constitutional status for the Maharaja while Kashmir became a republic, sort of a constitutional monarchy or some sort. And in 1940, even up till 1947, Kashmiris had not imagined that they would be compelled to choose between India and Pakistan, because both states did not exist before 1947. This, as I said, South Asia was a mosaic of identities and principalities and polities. So in 1947, as India and Pakistan emerged as the two successor states, with these two sets of political elite inheriting the empire, Kashmiris were suddenly subject to claims of these two countries. There had been, since 1930s, an ongoing struggle against the monarchy because of the repression. And Kashmiris remember this struggle as the Tehreek. Tehreek means movement. It was for political emancipation. It was for education. It was for sort of constitutional rights, equality. Kashmiri Muslims, as I said, have been oppressed under a Hindu feudal sort of system, and they had been reduced to the status of an enslaved population who were only good for expropriation of their labor and of their resources. And so that struggle sort of reached a dead end in 1947, because just at the moment when Kashmiris were really close to becoming a free country where they could determine their own future, these two giant states emerged and laid claims on Kashmir. And in 1947, the events took sort of a radical shape. Pakistan became a country on August 14, 1947. The next day, on August 15, India, became a country. The Maharaja of Kashmir sort of sent standstill agreements to both the countries, saying that give me time to determine which one I want to join. Pakistan accepted the standstill agreement. India did not accept the standstill agreement. So there was a lot of worry going on in the entire region that a Muslim majority region might fall into the hands of India. While in Kashmir, there was also a strong movement, as I said, which which did not had yet thought about joining India or Pakistan. There were some strong pro-Pakistan voices. There was strong pro-independence voices, but there were literally no pro-India voices. There were a small minority of Kashmiri Hindus who who were allied closely with the Congress party, but they constituted only 4% of the population. And also historically, Kashmiri, rivers, Kashmiri roads, logistics, all flowed through what became the Pakistani side of Punjab. There was literally no connection with what became India. So it Pakistani side, it is, I mean, it was clear, imagined that Kashmir was just going to fall into its basket. In fact, Jinnah, the leader of the Pakistani Muslim League, seems to have been much more worried about these other two large princely states called Hyderabad, which had a Hindu majority and a Muslim Nizam, and Junagadh, which also had a Hindu majority and a Muslim ruler, that how to sort of like find a way that they become part of Pakistan, because Muslim population across South Asia was not as concentrated in different places. They were mostly urbanized population. And so they didn't pay attention to what was happening in Kashmir. And in 1947 September, there were like members of the RSS who started coming into Kashmir, especially in the region of Jammu, where they started a campaign of harassment against the Muslims. In fact, the Maharaja's own army started to sort of disarm the Muslims in the region, and arming the Hindus in the region. It had dramatic and drastic consequences for the Muslims. And from October 1947 to 1948, June 1948, close to 500,000 Muslims from the region were forcibly evicted. Close to 237,000 people could not be accounted for. They were never found. And in Kashmir, in the Kashmiri memory, this is called like the Jammu massacre of 1947, which became like a foundational event in like what was to come. And Hindu nationalists had played a major role in sort of this ethnic cleansing. At that time, Nehru, who obviously knew what was happening, did nothing to prevent this violence. In fact, even Gandhi, who was until then very well known for sort of like fasting to preserve even Muslim lives in different places, did not do much to sort of stop this violence. And on October 26th, 27th, the date is like under sort of a lot of controversy. The Maharaja signed with the Indian government a treaty of accession. Under the Treaty of Accession, it was a colonial era, sort of like a treaty that the British typically signed with sort of these border states where, because there was this whole great game with the Russian Empire going on in the 1930s, in the late 19th century, and then later when the USSR emerged in the 1920s. So this whole great game was going on. So the British, the instrument of accession typically involved these principalities sort of giving British the rights over external affairs, defense, and communication. And that's what the instrument of accession was. The Maharaja of Kashmir, Hari Singh, signed this accession with the Nehru government. It gave India sort of power over three areas: external affairs, defense, and communication. And the treaty specifically stated that no future constitution of India, no laws that India made outside of this framework would be acceptable to Kashmir. In fact, in the next few years, the Indian government had to renegotiate this treaty with the new regime that came to power, led by a Kashmiri party called the National Conference, which was an anti-Muslim League party, which they did not like Pakistan, and I'll explain why. But they had grown closer to the Indian National Congress, and which allowed India then to sort of create a new set of relations with Kashmir that were totally imperialistic and colonial in their vision. So Kashmir became a site where you could then see what was happening in Pakistan. You could also see what was happening in India, because in Kashmir, this post-colonial rhetoric of nation building or democracy never worked, because the Indian government was determined that to keep Kashmir, they had to hold it at the point of the gun. In fact, Nehru is on record saying that democracy can wait in Kashmir. We have to hold it at the point of bayonet. And on the other hand, the Pakistanis continued making claims on Kashmir, but in truth, they had failed to sort of actually change any facts on the ground. 1947-48 war led to a stalemate, with Pakistan actually taking a small chunk of the territory, which became the Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and India occupying two-thirds of the territory and the most populated regions of the historical state. And it led to the UN resolution. The UN recognized the rights of the people of Kashmir to determine what they wanted to do. Nehru initially promised a plebiscite. It claimed that the Kashmiris would be given a right to determine their future, but by 1950s, early 1950 and 51, he basically did a turnaround. In fact, in 1953, he arrested Sheikh Abdullah, the leader of the National Conference itself, who had been his ally in Kashmir. In fact, Nehru had used Sheikh Abdullah to claim, see, Kashmiris are with India. But then he arrested him, changed the constitution through these presidential orders, and turned Kashmir into this colony. In fact, since from 1953 onwards till 1990s, Kashmir was managed as a colony, as a sort of this imperial outpost where regional satraps were, bestowed upon with favors, and then they were taken away uh, according to the wishes of the New Delhi government. Kashmir never truly had any autonomy. In fact, like if you look at the history from 1953 to 1990, governments in Kashmir were systematically dismissed. Opposition parties were suppressed. People were elected and selected, based on the wishes of the New Delhi government, and which is what became the background to the armed uprising that broke out in Kashmir in late 1989. And and since then you had the Indian government basically dropped the sheath from the gun, so to speak, and sort of brought in a huge number of military forces into Kashmir and launched a colonial war, which resulted in devastation of Kashmiri society. I mean, the trauma of the 90s lives on in Kashmir. I mean, there are reports that now the Indian government has suppressed, but which suggests that at least two out of or one out of every four Kashmiris has faced one or the other kind of torture at the hands of the Indian forces. Um, there isn't anyone in Kashmir right now who has not known or personally suffered both bodily or material loss. And there are like 10,000 people who are just like disappeared in Kashmir.
Thank you for laying out all of that history. There's some, kind of related points I want to dig in with you a little bit more in a bit. I want to pivot a little bit now because, I mean, folks in the chat are commenting on it. And, I mentioned to you the conversation I had with Amar Ali John that like the amount of comments and the very I mean, what's fascinating when we start having these conversations, the conversation with you and the conversation with Amar, and obviously your viewpoints are different. You're coming from different, contexts a little bit. You share some elements of your analysis, particularly, breaking down kind of this history of, what is how does this world develop in the post-colonial, sets of divisions and so on. And but what I find fascinating is the volume of primarily Hindu voices in the chat, in the replies to these conversations, that basically, you know, suggest that you all are propagandists, that you're planted by the Pakistani government, which is, I mean, it's quite funny in Amar's case because he's being tried for sedition in Pakistan, but the point I'm saying is that there's a volume of kind of internet trolling and internet propaganda related to any conversations around the subcontinent that are not kind of in the pro Hindutva kind of vein. And this connects also, I think, to what you've talked about in terms of the media ecosystem in India in particular, and how it's kind of been cultivated and developed. But there's also the social media aspect of it. And like people in the chat are making the comparison that it reminds them a lot of, Zionist trolls, and I agree with that. Although what I would say is that the volume of it and the intensity of it is actually even more extreme than what I see usually from Zionists online, who often, I mean, even though we've been doing anti-Zionist content, uh, specifically, primarily since October 7th, um, we don't get a whole lot of people that jump into our conversations to try to kind of, you know, basically people engage at such a rate with these conversations that there really almost just seems to be an attempt to distract, right, from what you are saying, but also to sow a bunch of confusion, right? That you're spreading misinformation, disinformation, that you don't know history, so on. And it's fascinating to me because both you and Amar, you're scholars, right? Like you're dealing with, scholarly inquiry, factual information, and history. And sure, everybody has a perspective, and I'm not suggesting that everything that you're saying is without your own, perspective or analysis of these events. At the same time, it's quite a fascinating thing to see basically what appears to be sets of people who don't share a set of facts or share a reality. And I mean, we have versions of this in the United States, of course, too. I mean, I think about, how polarized some of our political discourses around certain things. I do agree that social media has kind of contributed to this in a certain way, but it just comes to kind of another level when we start having conversations on the Indian subcontinent. And so I just wanted to see if you had some reflections on that.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the tragedies of South Asian politics has been consolidation of this identitarian politics that actually takes away from the basic and essential needs of the population. There are like close to 2 billion people, or like maybe probably, um, um, 1.9 billion people who live in that region. Uh, my perspective actually does not come from this identitarian politics. I'm perfectly aware of the flaws within Kashmiri society as well. I'm perfectly aware of those things. I mean, I I don't think, I'm here to defend the Pakistani state or the Indian state. I'm here to basically look at who are the multitudes in South Asia, what is their positionality. If you have to look at India, for instance, some of the most progressive voices actually come from the historically marginalized communities, be those Dalits, or communities among Sikh population, or the a Muslim population that has been sort of like targeted over the last 2 to 3 decades now. Who would not like? I mean, I tell this to people a lot that the most sort of uh, committed population to the idea of secularism in India is actually Indian Muslims, because it benefits them the most that the state be secular. you know the communities that want India to sort of erase these caste inequalities are Dalit communities. There are there are there's a war going on right now, a hidden war that people don't realize in the central India, in Chhattisgarh, where these indigenous communities called Adivasis have been targeted by Indian forces, and nobody even reports on that. These are like everyday cruelties and brutalities that are unfolding. In Pakistan, the same way. They have had a very similar approach to questions of representation, questions of rights towards Baloch people, towards the people in the federally administered territories, where these historical communities of, with ethnic tribal identities have been targeted. So I mean, or if you look at the work that has been done on the peasantry and the industrial workers in Punjabi cities, or if you look at the kinds of failed promises that have been made to the working classes and the peasantry in India. I mean, the idea of nation, either a Hindu nation or a Muslim nation, does not solve those problems. It's just like papering over those ideas. I know, it's not like the first time that I have seen people claim that voices like mine or voices like other people who try to sort of like have an alternative perspective to what has become dominant in South Asia is either like comes from one side or the other. I mean, these voices have been marginalized. Like if you take, especially India at this stage, if you look at their ecosystem, media ecosystem, the social media sphere, um, I mean, they have effectively silenced and squelched every anti-war voice. There used to be some. There were people both on the left. There were Gandhians, in fact, who were like, quite prominent in the anti-war movement. All of those voices have been silenced. Even the opposition is just like now compelled to stand behind forces. While I understand this sort of sense of patriotism that might emerge in the two countries. But the truth is that there are no reasons for war. There is no legitimate reason for war here, because any war is devastating to both countries. Yeah, India may harm Pakistan more, but Pakistan also can harm India. And where I come from, I worry about these communities who live along the borders, who are going to be the first victims, especially Kashmiris. In during the last 24 hours, um, probably around 40 Kashmiris have been killed on both sides of the border in shellings and attacks. Um, they have not evoked much sympathy in the media so much. Their lives have not, accounted for much. In fact, one of the persons killed in Poonch region in shelling from Pakistan was a Muslim man, which the Indian media claimed was a terrorist. This is how blindsided people have become in South Asia based on these identitarian politics. Yes, you mentioned Zionism. In fact, like some of the loudest voices on internet have been accounts from India that are masquerading as sort of people in the West. I wonder how much of this whole alt-right sort of system that had emerged in Europe and in the US is actually Indian accounts. I mean, it does. Unfortunately, there was a time when these voices did not matter so much, but now it is fueling hatred towards immigrants. It's fueling hatred towards minorities. And then in India, there's no end to it. It is sort of poising the entire society towards an internal war. Like, what do you do with 200 million people who exist as a minority in your country? It's not a small population. What does the Hindu nationalism have in its mind? What are they going to do? What are they expected to do? Like Indian Muslims right now, there are some people who have been like projected on Indian media. Look at these patriotic Muslims. This is what the kind of Muslims we want. But it's like, what about Muslims who just want to normally live? Who don't want to sort of like be shouting slogans all the time. Why are they being subjected to loyalty tests persistently? What kind of citizenship is that, right? In the same way, I think that I don't want to make equivalences between India and Pakistan all the time because there are significant differences as well. But at present, like, what is happening in Pakistan too is that voices that might like say, okay, calm down, let's not respond to every attack with an attack, they might soon be shut down as well, because when you get into the loop of war, it's easy to start a war, very hard to stop it.
Thank you for that, all of that context. I appreciate it. So I do want to talk. There's a couple of things that I want to get to. I mean, one is even in kind of Western accounts. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is the ways that this, current conflict, the recent set of events are kind of being discussed. And there's a way in which Kashmir is kind of central to them, of course, but also erased from the discussion, or because of the lack of historical context as well. um there may be some mention of you know an Indian administered Pakistan, or an Indian administered Kashmir and a Pakistan administered Kashmir. But like, even in the discussion, once the military aspects of it, kick off, obviously, um, it's not that everything that's happening is happening within the Kashmir region, but a majority of it certainly seems to be. And yet, as it gets discussed, it'll be something like, well, India fired some missiles into Pakistan, or Pakistan sent some drones over the border into India. But a lot of the space of what's actually, where the most intense kind of targeting seems to be happening is Kashmir, whether it's on one side of this border or another. And so there's a way that, as I was saying, it's kind of both central to this conflict, and also, you know decentered at the same time, because it becomes kind of subordinated to kind of a discussion of a border dispute, or saber rattling along the border of India and Pakistan. And it seems to me, I mean, you've kind of alluded to it throughout this conversation, but this is something quite central, to kind of the existence of Kashmir, more of going back further. And I think, I mean, one of the things that stood out to me is after, the Pahalgam, attack, or, that I was reading reports that schools in Kashmir were like bunkerizing, that they were like trying to figure out ways to prepare for attacks, basically, to figure out ways to try to shelter, students and presumably other people in Kashmir from what they were afraid was happening. There's also I don't know all the details around this, but kind of a disruption of water, going into Kashmir as well through a treaty that had been long standing. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, these realities in kind of a current context, and maybe a little bit of history about it as well, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess there are two parts of your question. One is Kashmir as this place which is getting targeted, in fact, and the second is the what is called the Indus Water Treaty. Let me just first address part one. Um, as I said already, Kashmir is one of the most densely militarized region. Um, on Indian side, there are large number of forces, and on Pakistani side, there are also significant number of forces, and there are a lot of military sites spread across. And so, not only does this, militarization sit on top of the local population, as sort of a giant foot on their neck, but it also is becomes like a potential target for their adversaries is targeting. If they're shooting missiles or bombs, they're going to target these places. I mean, it's not a surprise that apparently these three planes that Pakistan claims to have shot down fell in Kashmir. You know, and so Kashmir is extremely vulnerable to because it has been held hostage to this militarization. Um, it is very densely populated. The valley of Kashmir, it's actually not such a huge valley, but has close to 7 million people who live there. And then there are another 3, 4 million people who live in the hilly regions surrounding it. And on the other hand is like Pakistan, a Pakistani control side, which has where the villages and towns and cities are literally cheek by jowl with the line of control. And on a normal day, if there are no shooting games happening there, you can literally shout from one town to from the Pakistani control side to the Indian control side. And so those have been like consistently bombed. And this is not new. In fact, in 1998, India started bombing villages across the border intensely. In fact, for 3 years, those villages suffered quite a lot. And then Pakistan also responds, and they also target these are Muslims often who die in Kashmiri villages as well. So, it's not like that Pakistan is just like targeting Hindus. They're also targeting, whatever, uh, whoever lives there. And so that's why, Kashmir is in a very dangerous spot. I don't know if excuse me, if any nuclear exchange will take place, or if it happens, if the bombs will be dropped in Kashmir, which I perhaps don't think will happen. But I don't even know if that will ever happen. But if it is conventional warfare, most of it will be fought in Kashmir. So it's an extremely dangerous situation for Kashmiris. I know that there are some Kashmiris who have been like, we already live in a very tense, diminished life. Our lives have been like, we're subject to so much oppression. What would a war matter? But I want to sort of advise my fellow Kashmiris too that no, we are the ones who are going to be like at the first line of targeting. Now, the Indus-Water Treaty is a very interesting thing. It's perhaps the only successful sort of treaty that had held between India and Pakistan in the post-1947 era. The logic was very simple. In fact, the treaty benefited India to a large extent. So what happened? There are 5 rivers that come from east to west. These are Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Satluj, and then Ravi and Bias. 3 of them are in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, the first 3, and Ravi, Satluj, and Bias are they come from Himachal Pradesh area of northern India and flow through the Indian side of Punjab. And all of these sort of rivers merge in the Pakistani Punjab to form the Indus. That's why Punjab is called Punjab, 5 rivers. Now, in the Indus-Water Treaty, which was negotiated in the late 50s and early 1960s, the World Bank was like a main sort of facilitator of these discussions. India and Pakistan decided that the northern 3 rivers that flow through Kashmir will have its water will be used by Pakistan, while the southern 3 rivers, its water will be used by India. So, I mean, there's an entire international law about the upper and lower riparian states, which is what this whole logic was based on. Over the years, the Indian government sort of started building dams all across this region. my colleague Mona Ban, who is herself a Kashmiri Pandit. She has written a great scholar. She has written a book about the politics of dams in Kashmir. One of the things that happened was it started to change the ecology of Kashmir. In fact, this entire region is very vulnerable to earthquakes. Kashmir lies on a fault line. I mean, you can go back to history to think about how it became a fault line. But anyway, every major infrastructure is vulnerable. In fact, in 2005, there was a major earthquake that hit exactly the line of control, caused massive damage both in the Pakistani side of Kashmir and Indian side of Kashmir. And so these dams over the years have sort of allowed India to generate electricity, which it has connected to its northern grid. It powers its industrial sort of zones in northern India. Not much of it electricity actually is used by Kashmiris. They're not given this electricity. And but the flow of water, which Pakistan has complained a lot about over the years, they had the right to come and inspect and see if the water flow was going to be sort of suitable, that India was not blocking the water. What has happened now is that Indian government claimed that they have put the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance, which means that they are not going to sort of operationalize key parts of it, including inspection. And afterwards, it was the Indian media started sort of showing pictures of how the Indian government was collecting the water in the dams, and it's not going to allow any water to flow through. I mean, this is a really critical season for sowing in Punjab, in Pakistan, and other regions, because Pakistan is like all the water flows through the canal system, which irrigates a huge portion of the land, and it's called the Kharif season there, where water is intensively needed. This is the ice melt from the winter snows that go, melts in the Himalayas, goes through Kashmir, and then flows into Pakistan. It's critical. I mean, and the entire food security of the Pakistani state really depends on this water. Pakistan is primarily an agrarian society. So then Indian government started claiming that they had stopped the flow of water into Pakistan, which clearly is a violation of a whole host of international law, not to mention international humanitarian law. But then, but there's also an illogic to this. There's no reason, because where do you store water? At some point, the water will flow out. I mean, yesterday, India had to open some of those gates on the Chenab River, where one of the dams began to sort of like, there was like a little bit of an overflow, because there's no way for India to transport that water out of Kashmir. I mean, what are they going to pump it out? There's no way. It's a huge volume of water. And so, but it also sort of like gave this, I'm sure like the Pakistani establishment is like, well, we don't have water security, and gives them an incentive then further to sort of continue to be part of the dispute in Kashmir, because Pakistan has often claimed that Kashmir is the jugular vein of Pakistan. This is a quote actually from the founder of Pakistan, Jinnah, by which they meant that all the water flows through there, and without that jugular vein, we're going to be dead. And so what this Indian government regime has done right now is to sort of further create anxiety in the Pakistani society that India is determined to devastate Pakistan. In fact, like, the entire rhetoric that's coming out of the Indian media system is like, we will divide Pakistan into 4 countries. We're going to expand India. We'll turn Pakistan into Indian administered Pakistan, and things like that. I mean, a lot of it is literally the Zionist playbook. If you ask me, this the way they are like talking about these attacks, the terrorist infrastructure, killing of civilians, the drone attacks. It's like entirely framed by this post October 7, 2020 for narratives that have come, they just like adopt the same language um, that was used in this other context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that you can't really escape, thinking about at this moment is the ways that, post October 7th, what has been allowed on an international level in terms of how Israel has responded, um, that this has, you know, I mean, a question that people raise is what are the implications of this, within the so-called kind of liberal humanitarian order that we've had, the kind of norms that we've had. And I mean, I think that unfortunately it is exposed that a lot of transgression of these so-called norms is allowed if states are powerful enough to do so and have the right set of alliances and so on. And so I think it's a very dangerous time that way, even though I don't want to romanticize in any way the the period prior to that. Yeah, so one of the things that I do want to talk with you a little bit about, because I know this is an object of your own, research and study, is a little bit of history around armed struggle politics within Kashmir. I mean, you've kind of done I think, a great job of laying out all of the different contexts that would produce such, a political, kind of trajectory. But could you talk a little bit about that history and what do you think are some important things to understand about it?
Yeah, sure. So the movement actually has roots in this longer sort of struggle that I earlier described as Tehreek. It started as a movement for empowerment of Kashmiri Muslims against this Hindu sort of ruler in Kashmir at that time. Um, this movement got co-opted by the national conference parts of the national conference leadership in Kashmir in late 1940s, early 50s, and a lot of these people who had participated in that movement were either exiled to Pakistan or Pakistani administered Kashmir, and it sort of like looked like it was dying. And then in the 1970s, it reemerged. Late 1960s, early 1970s, there was this. I mean, globally, an upsurge of left movements. You remember the 1968 era. In India itself, there was a big event called, or a leftist movement called the Naxalbari event movement, often led by the peasantry. And in Pakistan, there were insurgency movements that had emerged at that time. And in Kashmir too, the early sort of this renewed Tehreek adopted a very national liberationist approach. That it saw itself as a national liberation movement against Indian colonialism. And this process continued until the 1980s, but it was sort of crushed by the police system that had emerged. In late 1980s, a group called Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front emerged, which claimed to be a secular organization with the goal of liberating Kashmir. And its claim was that it wanted to not only liberate Kashmir from India, but also from Pakistan, and so unify the historical state under the sign of secularism. That its manifesto said that all communities are the same. But this movement, like at the very beginning, was marked by a number of critical events. Some of them involved the Indian state brutally repressing Kashmiri protests. I mean, many Kashmiris remember massacres in Gaukadal, Srinagar, and Handwara, Tangpora. All of these are like very well known in Kashmir, if not outside, and which led led many people, many young Kashmiris, to actually cross the line of control, get arms training in the Pakistani side, and come back. During the same time, there was this, as I said earlier, a small minority of Kashmiri pundits. Some of them were targeted by Kashmiri militants. Um, it seemed that that many of them, those who were targeted, were government officials, but it's clear that there were some who were not. They were innocent people. They were not government officials. Not that the government officials were not innocent. In any case, it caused a lot of fear among the Kashmiri pundits who left overnight. In Not overnight, from January 19 to early April 1990, close to 160,000 Kashmiri pundits left Kashmir, which sort of like became sort of this really early sign that the armed struggle against a powerful state like India was never going to be fully in under the Kashmiri control. That it would create shadows and dark spots, and there would be there would be actors who would emerge who would not sort of follow the national liberationist sort of humanitarian politics, or those norms. In 19, as I said earlier, in 1994, 95, number as this these early groups started getting decimated, new groups came. They had a little more pan-Islamist orientation. Some of them were veterans from the Afghanistan campaigns against the Soviets. Some of them were from Pakistan. They had less to do with the national liberation movement than, with the idea that Kashmiri Muslims were being suppressed. So we need to have some kind of Muslim solidarity with them. There's a book by an anthropologist, Kaberi DeBerg Robinson, who talks about the considerations of these so-called jihadists at that time. And that phase sort of died down by 1999, early 2000s, with the rise of the counterinsurgency militias. And since then, since 2001, in 2002, there was an attack on the Indian Parliament, which led Indian government to mobilize its forces along the border with Pakistan. For 8 months, the two armies kind of like stood face to face with each other. No shots were fired, but hundreds of soldiers, especially from the Indian side, died during this preparation. But eventually it led to sort of breakout of a momentary sort of peace. There was India and Pakistan started having dialogue. Some for pro Tehreek forces in Kashmir began getting some space, who argued for dialogue between India and Pakistan and asked for a place for themselves at the table. And these events continued till 2008, and then there was an attack on in Mumbai that year, which sort of scuttled the whole thing. In Pakistan itself, as Pakistan got involved in the America-led so-called global war on terror, it faced a lot of blowback. And by 2007, there were like massive attacks happening within Pakistan itself. So nothing basically materialized in terms of peace between the two. And once a Modi government came to power, the rhetoric hardened. And there was like cultural boycotts. We're not going to play with cricket with each other. And then a lot of bombast about we're going to wipe out Pakistan, break it into 4 pieces, while Pakistani is saying we're going to like sort of like raise the flag in Delhi. And this situation sort of has kind of created this entire, almost like an personal, egotistical fight where they can't let the other one get a sort of one up on them. So instead of like reason and logic, realizing what the peoples of South Asia need, they have like raised the specter of this. But I think the true reason why the two countries, especially in India now, they do this is because the underlying fault lines within the societies, caste deeply sort of traumatic caste inequalities. India is one of the most unequal societies in the world, and in Pakistan, the military establishments sort of undercutting of any democratic aspirations and literally overthrowing any civilian governments causes them to just like play to the galleries, just like to rouse the nation again behind them, just to keep themselves in power.
Yeah. Um, I appreciate you laying out especially the issue of like, how deep the inequality is. And yeah, this kind of lowest common denominator, politics of, centering around nationalistic identity and so on, and how devastating that is for the region right now. I'm gonna kind of wind down, and then if the audience has questions, I'll see if I can pull some. Although there's so much chatter in the audience that I maybe not be able to catch that. But what I what I wanted to talk about next was the geopolitical kind of geopolitical alliances and um, you know, where does that sit with India and Pakistan, but also with Kashmir? And a few people have brought up the question of China. You raised that to me a little bit in a prior conversation. So could you talk a little bit about that, kind of the geopolitical dimensions that you see right now that are important to understand about this conflict and possible war?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so Kashmir actually became one of the first major sort of geopolitical issues after the United Nations was created. In fact, some of the resolutions, the first resolutions of the Security Council, are related to Kashmir. The key one being the UN Security Council Resolution 48, which called for demilitarization of Kashmir, creation of, and holding of a plebiscite in the region. In the beginning, all five members of the Security Council sort of voted in favor of it. But in the next few years, early 1950s, as the Cold War began, India tilted towards Soviet Union, and Pakistan sort of became part of the US-led alliance, the Baghdad Pact and whatnot. And in by 1950 mid 1950s, USSR was consistently voting or vetoing resolutions that could have asked us India to hold plebiscite or demilitarize the region, and by 1970s, India signed a friendship treaty with the USSR, while Pakistan became even closer to the West. um, in 1980s, as I said, as this Soviet Union sort of invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Pakistan became sort of a frontline state for the US, like one of the most valuable states. Pakistani army sort of started, taking its training from West Point and all of those places, while India grew closer and closer to Soviet Union. Like almost 90% of its equipment, military equipment, began coming from the USSR. Um, in the 1960s, also, there was another event that took place in South Asia that had big ramifications, although it wasn't felt immediately in Kashmir, though it happened on the borders of Kashmir. That was the war between China and India in 1962. The reason behind that war was that India have been pursuing a policy called the forward policy, where Nehru was basically asking its military to sort of go into these extremely, there's no population in those regions in what's called Ladakh region, to set up military checkpoints, bases, spots to delineate the territory. and they were exchanging. India was using a British era map for what it considered to be its legitimate territory, while China was using a different sort of a map, and it led to a confrontation. It was a swift war in which um, India sort of lost that war, and it wasn't like a full-on defeat or anything, because there's literally no one loses or wins when you have these two big nations. But what happened was India sort of de facto accepted Chinese control over a region called Aksai Chin. In the meantime, China also took some chunks of land in the eastern part called Arunachal Pradesh. What happened then was that China and Pakistan started growing closer. In fact, Pakistan gave control voluntarily of a region called Shaksgam Valley to China. And China and Pakistan grew closer. And as China-USSR relations flared up, their mini border war, Pakistan became sort of a mediator between um, US and China. It's called this whole ping pong Kissinger diplomacy, and it opened up diplomatic relations between China and the US. And so fast forward to the 1990s, USSR disintegrates, and India starts a soft pivot towards the US. And US has no need for Pakistan anymore, and so it wants, India is starting to grow as an economy, and it's claiming that its middle class is growing now, and so US seeks Indian markets at that time, and so India and US start growing closer. And by early 2000s, the Bill Clinton visit that I mentioned earlier, uh, US was sort of quickly trying to replace, do a full tilt towards India. But then 9/11 happened, and Pakistan sort of again became a frontline state during this time. And then this whole event around Osama and all of those things became a reason where the US government officials in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, started to sort of see Pakistan as a problematic country while courting India. Um, in 2019, when the Modi government basically took away the autonomy of Kashmir, semi-autonomous status of Kashmir, it also passed another sort of presidential order, which was called the Reorganization of the State of Jammu and Kashmir, according to which the historical state of Jammu and Kashmir was split into two union territories. These were like now going to be directly controlled from New Delhi. One was Jammu Kashmir, another was Ladakh. So um, the Chinese government next year in 2020 took it as a sign that somehow this change in the territorial status in the status quo was a sign that things are fluid. And that year, India found out that Chinese troops had crossed what is called the line of actual control and taken huge chunks of land under its control in Ladakh. A confrontation later that summer. There were no firefights, but they were using these sort of medieval weapons to hurt each other, led to border skirmishes in which I think around 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers sort of died. And over the years, Pakistan sort of, as US stopped its like giving weapons to Pakistan, it started to source most of its weapons from China, while India continued to source its weapons from Russia, and it also started to buying weapons from Israel, especially surveillance equipment, border surveillance equipment. And while the American equipment was quite expensive, but just to appease the U.S. government, it started buying American, weapons as well. And now they started then buying weapons from France as well. These new jets that Pakistan claims to have shot down are called the Rafales, and they are French made, and they're very expensive pieces of equipment. Excuse me. And So you have a very complicated geopolitical picture that's like focused right on Kashmir. We have three nuclear power countries, Pakistan, India, and China, literally with their claws, controlling the historical state, three parts of the historical state. Um, any conflict, if there's a wider global conflict, which it seems that we were going through some kind of like a strange times, right? Because we've been lulled into believing that the sort of this strange, of course, there were so many wars in between, but this strange long peace globally that had lasted in the post 1945 era was going to be forever. But we have clearly reached a time with events that are happening in Ukraine, Palestine, with now happening in South Asia, not to mention Sudan and all these other places that are erupting, that we are probably in some kind of a major global conflagration already. It's just that we have not recognized it. And so what Kashmir is literally what Bill Clinton had said when he visited in 2000. He called it a nuclear flashpoint, which means that what he was saying was that if there is a nuclear war that happens, it will start there because of Kashmir. And so if we are willing to sort of like sleepwalk into a global disaster, that's one thing. But if we are trying to prevent that, if we're trying to retain some degree of sanity in the world, people need to pay attention. The governments around the world need to counsel these countries, especially the Indian state now, to quickly de-escalate, to not do this. This is going to be a very expensive, if even if the nuclear weapons are not going to be used, it's going to be a very expensive war. Like, both countries have there's some most major population centers very close to the border, especially Pakistan. Pakistani cities are very close to the border. Indian cities are not so far away. Mumbai, Delhi, Jaipur, Ahmedabad, and so many other places in Punjab. They're very close, and these are cities that are spread out, but they have millions and millions of people living in them. If there was like a major conventional fight and these cities were targeted, it could lead to displacement of hundreds of millions of people, creating another sort of wave of migrations around the world. And this is like if the nuclear war doesn't happen.
Right. Thank you so much for just all the information that you've shared with us today. Um, the I guess a couple of things. In closing, are there any things that you would want to say or share with folks or encourage people to kind of check out? And related to that too, you kind of started in that last question to talk about the urgency of this issue. And obviously from our perspective as a platform, foundational to why we started this and what we try to do is to really bring forth anti-imperialist perspectives. And sometimes that can be complicated to navigate because you're trying to figure out, what is the anti-imperialist perspective on a situation with, multiple actors and, all of this kind of thing. But um, I guess what I would say, yeah, I guess those two things, anything that you would want to close with for people or point them towards, but also how do you think that, anti-imperialists should really approach, this particular situation?
Well, I think that one of the key confusions that has sort of prevented an actual anti-imperialist solidarity across the world is that people have only focused on Western imperialism. This is, of course, there is a phenomena called Western imperialism. Nobody's denying it's like a very well discussed and rightly so. But there is also non-Western forms of imperialism that operate on very similar logics. Their roots may be different. They may be, they may come from places that don't appear like imperialistic, but are. One of the consistent issues I have with some of the South Asian left is not to see their own countries as imperialistic. They would like be, um, they are loud and clear about imperialism that the US has around the world. But when it comes to India, they become very nationalist about it. And which is sort of like depressing, given that they know the reality of what has happened. It's easy to take on the nationalist mantle, uh, and it's easy to sort of like imagine that somehow, the global South is simply a victim of imperialism. But we have to recognize that there are imperial formations elsewhere as well. And unless we recognize that, we're not going to form true global solidarity, which is based on common shared human flourishing. Otherwise, we're just going to have this dissonant sort of worldview where in the West we are anti-imperialist, but elsewhere we just like become nationalist. That's not the correct or even a Marxist way of looking at things.
I appreciate it. Thank you, so much for this discussion today. It's been, I've definitely learned a lot, and I look forward to kind of going back and re-listening to it as well, because I know that there was a lot of pieces that you covered that warrant close attention. And perhaps we can have a follow up at some point if if things shift, or if there's more context that we want to provide in a certain area. um yeah, I thank you so much. Appreciate this.
Thank you, Jared. Yeah, thank you.